Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the counter and keep your hands where I can see them. The sentence cut cleanly through the warm morning noise of the cafe, sharp enough that every conversation stopped mid-word. The espresso machine hissed once and fell silent. A paper cup slipped slightly in Marcus Bennett's hand as he turned slowly toward the voice behind him. For a moment, no one moved. The smell of roasted beans hung in the air. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows facing Market Street, and outside a line of commuters hurried past without noticing that inside the cafe something had suddenly shifted. Marcus stood tall and still, dressed in a charcoal suit that had already seen a long morning. His tie was loosened slightly, the top button of his shirt open in the quiet way of someone who had been working since before sunrise. In front of him on the counter sat a small cardboard sleeve waiting for a 16-ounce latte that the barista had just called his name for seconds earlier. He had come in for something simple, coffee before a meeting downtown, a few quiet minutes before another day that promised paperwork, briefings, and long hours behind federal doors that most people never saw. But now the quiet rhythm of the cafe had been replaced by something colder. Officer Ryan Caldwell stood near the entrance, one hand resting near the radio clipped to his shoulder, eyes locked on Marcus with a look that felt less like caution and more like judgment already decided. The officer's uniform was crisp, the badge polished bright enough to reflect the light pouring through the windows, and yet the tension in the room had nothing to do with procedure. Several customers glanced at each other uncertainly. One man near the window lowered his newspaper slowly. A woman holding a laptop paused with her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The barista behind the counter froze with a metal pitcher in her hand. Marcus turned fully now, calm but alert, his expression steady in a way that came from years of learning how quickly ordinary moments could change. "Officer," he said evenly, his voice controlled and measured. "Is there a problem?" Caldwell stepped closer, his boots making quiet contact with the polished floor. His gaze traveled from Marcus's suit jacket to the watch on his wrist, and finally to the coffee waiting on the counter. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," the officer said, his tone firm, official, but carrying something beneath it that didn't quite match the words. "I need to ask you a few questions." Outside, a city bus rumbled past the corner, its brakes sighing against the curb. Inside, the cafe remained completely still. Marcus nodded slowly, not defensive, not confrontational, simply acknowledging the moment the way someone does who has learned patience long before today. "Of course," he replied, "but I'm just here for coffee." Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the simplicity of the answer didn't fit the picture already forming in his mind. The officer took another step forward. Somewhere behind Marcus, a phone lifted quietly, its camera angled toward the unfolding scene. Another customer shifted in his seat, unsure whether to watch or pretend nothing unusual was happening. Marcus glanced briefly at the cup waiting on the counter, the foam art beginning to fade as seconds passed, then returned his attention to the officer. His posture remained calm, his breathing slow and steady, the kind of composure built over years of federal work where staying measured mattered more than reacting quickly. But the tension in the room kept growing, subtle yet undeniable, like a pressure change before a storm. Officer Caldwell spoke again, louder now, the authority in his voice filling every corner of the cafe. "Sir, I said keep your hands visible." Marcus lifted his hands slightly away from his sides in quiet compliance, his expression unchanged, though several customers exchanged uneasy looks. The barista finally set the metal pitcher down softly on the counter, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have in the silence. Marcus Bennett had walked into the cafe expecting nothing more than a morning latte before work. Instead, without anyone in the room realizing it yet, the next few minutes were about to become the beginning of a story that would travel far beyond this quiet corner of the city. Marcus Bennett kept his hands visible exactly where the officer could see them, his fingers relaxed, his shoulders steady, his breathing slow and measured, as though this moment were simply another routine interruption in a long day. The customers inside the cafe remained frozen in a quiet uncertainty that filled the room heavier than the smell of fresh espresso. Marcus had experienced moments like this before, not identical, never identical, but familiar enough that his mind did not rush ahead of the present second. Instead, he stood still and let the room breathe. He glanced briefly at the name written across the cardboard sleeve waiting on the counter. The barista's handwriting slightly slanted, the word Marcus written carefully in black marker, as if the morning had begun completely ordinary. Just 15 minutes earlier the city had felt calm and predictable. Marcus had parked his sedan along the curb 2 blocks away, checked the time on the dashboard clock, and stepped into the crisp air of a mild October morning. The sidewalks downtown were busy but not chaotic, commuters moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had already repeated the same routine hundreds of mornings before. Marcus had walked past a newsstand where the early editions of the paper were stacked in neat rows, headlines about local elections and sports scores catching the corner of his eye without holding his attention. His focus had been on the meeting waiting ahead of him in a federal office building 3 blocks south. The meeting was scheduled for 9:30 sharp, a briefing involving several departments and a case file that had taken months to assemble. Marcus Bennett was not simply another agent assigned to a desk. He was a supervisory agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, responsible for overseeing investigations that most people in the city would never hear about until long after the work had already been completed. Years earlier, when Marcus first entered federal service, he had learned quickly that authority often arrived quietly, without fanfare, and that the weight of responsibility came not from the badge itself, but from the decisions made while wearing it. That morning he had chosen the café because it sat exactly halfway between his parking spot and the federal building, a small routine that allowed him 10 minutes of quiet before the day officially began. The barista had greeted him with the same polite smile she gave every customer, and Marcus had placed a simple order without mentioning who he was or where he worked. He rarely did. There was something peaceful about being just another person standing in line for coffee, listening to the low murmur of conversation and the soft music playing through ceiling speakers. Now that ordinary moment had transformed into something entirely different. Officer Caldwell shifted his stance slightly near the entrance, his gaze never leaving Marcus as though the officer believed the situation required constant vigilance. A few customers exchanged cautious glances. One man slowly reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his phone, holding it low but steady as the camera lens pointed toward the unfolding scene. Marcus noticed the movement without reacting. His attention remained on the officer, not because he felt threatened, but because he understood that every word spoken next would shape what happened afterward. Marcus Bennett had spent years studying procedure, policy, and the complex boundary between authority and accountability. He knew exactly how these encounters were supposed to unfold. Calm communication, clear explanation, respect for both sides. Yet standing there beneath the soft lights of the cafe, with his coffee cooling quietly on the counter and a dozen strangers watching in silence, Marcus could already sense that this moment was beginning to drift away from routine and into something far more complicated than a simple morning question. Officer Ryan Caldwell had begun his shift just before sunrise, the pale gray light of early morning still hanging over the city streets when he stepped out of the precinct parking lot and settled into the driver's seat of his patrol car. For Caldwell, the rhythm of the job had become something mechanical after years on the force. The radio chatter, the slow crawl of traffic through downtown intersections, the steady scanning of sidewalks and storefront windows for anything that seemed out of place. He had learned to trust his instincts more than anything written in the handbook, and those instincts had slowly shaped the way he looked at people as the years passed. Some faces he barely noticed at all. Others he studied longer than necessary. In Caldwell's mind, experience had sharpened his judgment, though the line between caution and assumption had quietly blurred without him realizing it. That morning had started like many others. A routine patrol route through the business district, a brief stop to speak with a parking officer near the courthouse, and then a slow pass along Market Street where cafes and small shops had just begun filling with the early crowd of office workers. The dispatcher's voice had come through the radio only minutes earlier, mentioning a vague report from a nearby block. Someone had called about a man lingering near storefronts, watching people enter and leave buildings. The report had been brief, uncertain, and lacking details, but Caldwell had already been nearby when he heard it. To him it sounded like the kind of small call that could turn important if ignored. He had turned the patrol car toward the corner where the cafe sat, the blue and white sign glowing softly above the door as commuters stepped in and out carrying paper cups and laptops. When Caldwell pushed open the door and stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanned the room the same way they always did. Tables along the window, two college students sharing a pastry, a businessman speaking quietly into a phone near the back wall. And then there was Marcus Bennett standing at the counter in a dark suit, tall, composed, and silent as he waited for the drink that had just been called. Caldwell had noticed the watch first, polished and expensive looking beneath the cuff of the jacket. Then he noticed the calm posture, the kind of stillness that sometimes made officers suspicious because it looked too controlled. In Caldwell's mind the pieces formed quickly, faster than they should have. A man matching a vague description. Standing alone. Watching the room. The officer had stepped forward before fully questioning the conclusion already forming in his thoughts. Now the cafe had grown quiet enough that even the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter sounded unusually loud. Caldwell studied Marcus carefully, convinced that asking questions was the correct step, yet the firmness in his tone suggested that his mind had already decided this interaction was not simply casual conversation. Marcus remained composed, hands visible, his eyes meeting the officer's without hostility but also without submission. For Caldwell the calmness did not ease the tension. Instead it seemed to confirm the idea that something about this man needed further explanation. Outside the windows the city continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Cars rolled slowly through the intersection, a cyclist passed along the curb, and a delivery truck paused briefly before continuing down the block. Inside the cafe the tension remained suspended in the air between the officer and the man standing at the counter. Caldwell took another small step forward, the polished badge on his chest catching the morning light, unaware that the quiet decision he had made only moments earlier would soon reach far beyond the walls of this small coffee shop and into places neither he nor anyone else in the room could yet imagine. Marcus Bennett kept his hands steady where the officer could see them, the calm in his posture almost quieting the tension that had settled across the cafe. The latte on the counter beside him had begun to cool, a thin swirl of foam collapsing slowly along the rim of the cup. For several seconds neither man spoke, and the silence carried a strange weight that everyone in the room could feel. Marcus finally turned slightly toward the counter, not to reach for the drink, but to place his wallet gently on the polished surface as if reminding himself that the moment was still ordinary, still manageable. He looked back at Officer Caldwell and spoke in the same measured tone he had used before. "Officer, I understand you have a job to do, but I am on my way to a meeting downtown, and I would like to finish purchasing my coffee." Caldwell did not respond immediately. His eyes moved from the wallet on the counter to Marcus's face, then briefly toward the customers standing nearby. Something about the calm explanation did not soften the officer's posture. Instead his shoulders tightened slightly, as if the quiet confidence in Marcus's voice made him more certain that further questioning was necessary. "I asked you a simple request," Caldwell replied, his voice firm and carrying across the cafe. "Remain where you are and answer a few questions." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the statement without resistance. He had encountered tense moments before in federal work, situations where patients often resolved misunderstandings faster than confrontation. "That is fine," Marcus said evenly. "You may ask what you need to ask." Behind the counter, the barista slowly slid the finished drink closer to the edge, unsure whether anyone would reach for it. A faint murmur moved through the room as customers shifted in their seats. Caldwell stepped closer now, close enough that the badge on his uniform caught the reflection of the overhead lights. "What are you doing in this area this morning?" the officer asked. Marcus answered without hesitation. "I am heading to a meeting at the federal building 3 blocks south of here." Caldwell's expression did not change. "And where do you work?" The question hung briefly in the air. Marcus glanced toward the cup again and then back to the officer. "I work for the federal government," he replied calmly. The response, simple and factual, seemed to pause the moment for a second. One customer near the window lowered his phone slightly, as if trying to hear more clearly. Caldwell crossed his arms. "That is a very general answer," he said. "I am going to need something more specific." Marcus took a slow breath. His voice remained even, almost conversational. "Officer, my name is Marcus Bennett. I am a supervisory agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." For a brief second the room felt as though the air itself had stopped moving. The words were not dramatic, not raised in volume, simply spoken with quiet clarity. Yet the effect was immediate. Several customers looked at each other in confusion. The barista blinked as if she had not expected that answer at all. Caldwell, however, did not step back. His expression hardened slightly, as if the statement sounded less like information and more like a challenge. Anyone can say that. The officer replied after a moment. Do you have identification? Marcus nodded again, still calm, still patient. Yes, I do. But before I reach into my jacket, I want to make sure you understand that I am cooperating with you. Caldwell gestured toward Marcus's chest. Slowly, he said. The instruction carried a tone that suggested the situation had already become more serious than it needed to be. Marcus moved carefully, slipping one hand inside his suit jacket and removing a small leather credential holder. He placed it gently on the counter rather than handing it directly to the officer, allowing Caldwell to see it clearly without sudden movement. The badge inside caught the cafe lights with a faint metallic reflection. Marcus said nothing else. He simply waited. Yet even as the badge rested on the counter between them, the tension in the room did not disappear. In fact, it deepened, because what should have been the end of the misunderstanding was slowly becoming the beginning of something far more complicated. Officer Ryan Caldwell looked down at the leather credential holder resting on the counter as if it were simply another object to inspect rather than something that might change the direction of the entire encounter. The small badge inside reflected the cafe lights with a muted shine, the engraved seal unmistakable to anyone familiar with federal identification. Yet Caldwell did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he kept his arms folded and studied Marcus Bennett's face again, as though weighing whether the calm confidence in front of him was genuine or simply another attempt to deflect questioning. Around them, the cafe remained quiet in that strange way public places sometimes do when everyone senses they are witnessing something unusual. The man near the window who had been holding his phone raised it slightly again, the camera lens aimed carefully but discreetly toward the counter. Another customer slowly stepped back from the pickup area, creating a few more inches of space between themselves and the two men at the center of the room. Marcus remained completely still. His wallet lay open on the counter beside the credential holder, and his untouched coffee sat inches away, the steam fading gradually into the warm air. He had already done everything procedure required. He had answered questions calmly, identified himself clearly, and placed his credentials where they could be examined without misunderstanding. In most circumstances, that would have resolved the moment. But Officer Caldwell did not move to verify the badge right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if the situation had become a puzzle he had not expected. You are telling me you are with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Caldwell said slowly. Marcus nodded once. That is correct. Caldwell finally leaned forward enough to look more closely at the identification without touching it. The gold and blue emblem inside the holder was clearly visible from where he stood, along with Marcus Bennett's name printed beside it. For a brief second, the officer's eyes lingered there. Yet rather than ending the interaction, Caldwell straightened again and exhaled quietly through his nose. You understand, he said, his voice still firm, that anyone could carry something that looks official. The words drifted across the room and settled like a cold breeze through the quiet cafe. Marcus did not respond immediately. He had spent years working alongside law enforcement agencies across the country. He understood that verification sometimes required caution. But he also recognized when a situation was moving beyond simple caution into something else entirely. Officer, Marcus replied evenly. You are welcome to call it in through your dispatcher. They can confirm my position within a few minutes. A faint murmur moved through the customers nearby. The suggestion sounded reasonable, almost obvious, yet Caldwell's posture remained rigid. The officer glanced toward the door briefly, then back at Marcus, as if measuring how much control he believed he still held over the moment. Outside the window, a city bus rolled past the intersection, its reflection sliding across the cafe glass like a slow-moving shadow. Inside, the tension grew heavier with every passing second. Caldwell finally reached down and picked up the credential holder, turning it slightly beneath the lights. He studied the badge again, the engraved lettering, the photograph inside, and the federal seal stamped beside the identification card. For a moment, the entire room seemed to lean forward in silent anticipation. But instead of handing the credential back or calling it in for confirmation, Caldwell placed it back on the counter with deliberate care. His eyes returned to Marcus Bennett. "Until that is verified," the officer said, "I am going to need you to remain here while we sort this out." The statement sounded procedural, yet the tone carried something heavier, something that suggested the officer had already decided the direction of the encounter. Marcus looked at the credential holder resting between them, then slowly lifted his gaze again. He had arrived at the cafe expecting a quiet cup of coffee before a federal meeting that would begin in less than 30 minutes. Now the meeting clock continued ticking somewhere beyond the cafe walls, and the simple pause in his morning had quietly become a situation that was drawing more attention with every passing second. The people watching from the tables could feel it too. The moment was no longer just an officer asking questions. Something larger had begun unfolding, though none of them yet understood how far the consequences of this quiet standoff were about to travel. Marcus Bennett remained standing exactly where he was, the quiet steadiness in his posture almost contrasting with the growing tension inside the cafe. The leather credential holder still rested on the counter between him and Officer Ryan Caldwell, its polished seal catching the soft glow of the overhead lights each time someone shifted nearby. For a moment Marcus glanced toward the front window where the city continued moving without interruption. Cars passed through the intersection in steady lines. A cyclist paused briefly at the traffic light before pushing forward again. To anyone outside, the cafe looked completely normal. Inside, however, the air felt different, heavier with a silence that no one seemed eager to break. Marcus slowly exhaled and shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, careful not to make any movement that could be misunderstood. Years of federal training had taught him something simple but important about tense moments. Control the pace. Do not escalate the situation. Let the facts reveal themselves when the time is right. He glanced briefly at the clock on the wall above the pastry display. 9:18 in the morning. His meeting at the federal building would begin in 12 minutes. Normally Marcus Bennett arrived early to every briefing. Preparation mattered in his line of work. Yet standing there now, he understood that the schedule for the morning had already changed. Officer Caldwell still stood near the entrance, his radio occasionally crackling with distant dispatch chatter that drifted faintly through the room. The officer had not yet called in the identification Marcus had offered. Instead, he watched Marcus carefully, as though waiting for some unexpected move that might confirm the suspicion he had already formed. Several customers remained quietly seated but attentive. The man near the window continued recording with his phone, holding it low against the table so the camera lens remained aimed toward the counter. A woman sitting beside the pastry case folded her hands together and whispered something to the friend seated across from her. Even the barista behind the counter had stopped preparing orders, her attention shifting repeatedly between the officer and the calm man waiting beside the untouched coffee. Marcus noticed all of it without reacting. His experience had taught him that public attention could transform a routine misunderstanding into something much larger. He spoke again, his voice still calm, steady enough that every word carried clearly through the quiet room. "Officer Caldwell, you have my credentials on the counter. You also have my full name. If you contact your dispatcher, they can confirm my position within the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Caldwell did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the door again as though considering whether additional officers should be involved, then returned his gaze to Marcus. The pause stretched long enough that several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus did not raise his voice or repeat the suggestion. Instead, he simply waited. His patience was not passive. It was deliberate. The same patience that had helped him navigate complex investigations, tense interviews, and difficult negotiations over many years of federal service. Finally, Caldwell lifted the radio attached to his shoulder, his thumb resting near the button as though he might speak into it. For a moment, the entire cafe seemed to lean forward in anticipation. But the officer hesitated, lowering the radio again without saying anything. Marcus watched the small movement carefully. That hesitation told him something important. The officer had reached a point where verifying the identification might force him to reconsider the assumptions he had already made. And reconsidering those assumptions in front of a room full of witnesses was not something every officer welcomed easily. Outside the window, a breeze moved through the row of trees lining the sidewalk, scattering a few dry leaves across the pavement. Inside the cafe, the quiet tension continued building second by second. Marcus Bennett had not raised his voice. He had not resisted. He had simply presented the truth and allowed the moment to unfold. Yet the longer the silence lasted, the more obvious it became to everyone watching that this situation was no longer about a simple question inside a coffee shop. Something deeper had taken hold, and the outcome now depended entirely on whether Officer Ryan Caldwell was willing to accept the reality that had been placed directly in front of him. The silence inside the cafe stretched long enough that even the faint ticking of the wall clock began to sound louder than usual. Marcus Bennett stood calmly beside the counter, his untouched latte still resting near the edge where the barista had placed it minutes earlier. The thin swirl of foam had nearly disappeared now, leaving a pale ring around the inside of the cup. Marcus glanced briefly at the clock again. 9:22. The meeting at the federal building had already begun without him. Yet his attention remained on the officer standing across from him, because the outcome of this moment now mattered far more than any meeting agenda waiting 3 blocks away. Officer Ryan Caldwell shifted his stance again, his eyes moving between the credential holder on the counter and the composed man standing in front of him. The small leather wallet containing the federal badge had not moved since Marcus placed it there. It remained open, the seal clearly visible, the identification card unmistakably printed with Marcus Bennett's name and title. Several customers in the cafe had leaned forward slightly, watching the scene unfold with a quiet tension that seemed to pull the entire room inward. The man near the window continued recording with his phone, the faint reflection of the screen visible in the glass behind him. Caldwell reached up once more and touched the radio attached to his shoulder. This time his thumb did not hesitate as long. He pressed the button and spoke quietly into the microphone. The words were low enough that only fragments reached the nearest tables, but everyone in the room could tell the moment had shifted. The dispatcher's voice answered faintly through the speaker, a soft burst of static followed by a quick confirmation request. Caldwell spoke Marcus Bennett's name slowly, spelling it out letter by letter. The seconds that followed felt longer than they should have. Marcus did not move. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unchanged, his patience steady in a way that came from years of navigating tense professional encounters. The dispatcher's reply returned through the radio with a sharper clarity than before. Even the customers seated farther away could hear enough to understand what had just happened. Confirming, the voice said through the static. Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Bennett, Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division. The words settled across the cafe like a sudden change in weather. The quiet murmurs that followed were impossible to ignore. Someone near the pastry display whispered softly in surprise. The barista's eyes widened slightly as she looked from Marcus to the officer. For the first time since entering the cafe, Officer Caldwell's posture changed in a way that was impossible to miss. His shoulders stiffened, and his gaze returned slowly to the badge resting on the counter between them. In that moment, the meaning of the encounter finally reached him with full clarity. The man he had been questioning for the past several minutes was not simply another customer standing in line for coffee. Marcus Bennett was a federal supervisory agent responsible for overseeing investigations involving civil rights violations, including cases that sometimes examine the conduct of local law enforcement agencies. The realization moved through the room almost as quickly as it moved through Caldwell's thoughts. Marcus watched the officer carefully, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the quiet focus of someone who understood that the truth had finally arrived exactly where it needed to be. Outside the cafe window, the city traffic continued flowing through the intersection, unaware that inside the small coffee shop a moment of quiet confirmation had just changed the direction of the entire morning. Officer Caldwell lowered his hand slowly from the radio. For the first time since the encounter began, the certainty in his expression had faded. The room remained silent, waiting to see what he would do next. Marcus Bennett simply stood beside the counter, patient as ever, the untouched cup of coffee still waiting beside him as the weight of the confirmation settled fully into the air between them. Officer Ryan Caldwell stood motionless for several seconds after the dispatcher's confirmation faded from the radio. The faint static crackled once more and then disappeared, leaving the cafe wrapped again in the same heavy quiet that had been building since the moment he first stepped through the door. The difference now was that the silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried clarity. Caldwell's eyes moved slowly from the radio on his shoulder down to the leather credential holder resting on the counter. The badge inside it had not changed, yet the meaning behind it now filled the room in a way that could not be ignored. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he had been standing the entire time. His posture was still calm, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze steady but not confrontational. There was no trace of satisfaction in his expression, no attempt to emphasize the moment that had just unfolded. If anything, the quiet patience in his demeanor seemed to deepen as he waited for the officer to process what had just happened. Around them, the customers inside the cafe exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. The man near the window slowly lowered his phone from recording position, though the camera was still pointed in the same direction. A woman near the pastry display leaned slightly toward her friend and whispered something that sounded like disbelief. Even the barista behind the counter seemed to exhale softly, as though the tension that had been building in the room had finally found its answer. Officer Caldwell reached forward and picked up the credential holder again. This time his hands moved with a careful precision that had not been there before. He examined the badge once more, the engraved lettering, the official seal, the identification card bearing Marcus Bennett's name and title. The details that had been visible all along now seemed to hold a weight he had not recognized earlier. Caldwell closed the leather holder slowly and placed it back on the counter in front of Marcus. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something immediately, but the words did not arrive right away. The city outside the cafe windows continued its normal rhythm, unaware that inside the small shop a quiet moment of realization had just shifted the entire atmosphere. Finally Caldwell spoke, his voice lower than before. "Agent Bennett," he said, carefully choosing the title he had just heard confirmed through the radio. The change in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus nodded once in acknowledgement. "Officer," he replied evenly. Caldwell glanced briefly toward the customers watching from their tables, then back to Marcus again. The presence of witnesses in the room was impossible to ignore now. Every movement, every word, had been observed from the moment the encounter began. "It appears there was a misunderstanding this morning," Caldwell said. The statement sounded formal, almost rehearsed, yet the pause that followed suggested he understood that the explanation alone did not erase the tension that had already filled the room. Marcus looked down briefly at the closed credential holder resting on the counter, then lifted his gaze again. "Officer," he said calmly, "situations like this can happen. The important thing is how they are handled once the facts are clear." The words were not accusatory. They were measured, deliberate, the kind of statement that carried both professionalism and quiet accountability at the same time. Caldwell seemed to consider the sentence carefully before responding. He gave a short nod, though his expression remained tight with the awareness of how the situation had unfolded in front of an audience. The barista gently slid the untouched latte a few inches closer to Marcus again, as though returning the cafe to its normal routine. The cup had cooled completely by now, yet the simple gesture seemed to remind everyone that the moment had begun with nothing more complicated than a man waiting for coffee. Marcus picked up the credential holder and slipped it back inside his jacket pocket with unhurried movements. He then reached for the cup, wrapping his hand around it for the first time since entering the cafe. For a brief moment the tension in the room softened, though the weight of the encounter remained present in the quiet glances shared among the customers who had witnessed it all. Officer Caldwell stepped slightly to the side, clearing the path toward the door. The gesture was small but unmistakable. Marcus Bennett had walked into the cafe expecting 10 quiet minutes before work. Instead, those minutes had turned into a moment that would soon carry consequences far beyond the walls of the coffee shop. Though at that exact second the only sound anyone heard was the faint rustle of the cafe door opening as the morning outside continued exactly as it always had. Marcus Bennett stepped out of the cafe into the bright mid-morning light, the cool October air brushing against his face as the glass door closed quietly behind him. For a moment he paused on the sidewalk, the paper cup still warm in his hand, and looked down the street toward the federal building that stood 3 blocks away. The city continued its rhythm without hesitation. Cars moved steadily through the intersection, a bus released a soft sigh of air as passengers stepped off near the corner, and a group of office workers crossed the street carrying briefcases and backpacks. To anyone passing by, nothing about the scene appeared unusual. Yet inside the cafe behind him, several customers still stood near the windows watching the man who had just walked out, aware that the quiet encounter they had witnessed would likely travel far beyond the walls of that small shop. Marcus lifted the cup slightly and took the first sip he had intended to enjoy nearly 20 minutes earlier. The coffee had cooled more than he preferred, but the taste still carried the rich bitterness of freshly roasted beans. He began walking again, his pace steady and unhurried as he moved down the sidewalk toward the federal building. Inside the cafe, Officer Ryan Caldwell remained standing near the door for several seconds after Marcus left. The room felt different now, as though the tension that had filled it earlier had been replaced by something heavier and more reflective. Caldwell glanced toward the tables where several customers were quietly gathering their belongings. The man who had recorded the encounter slipped his phone into his jacket pocket, but not before checking the screen one last time. The brief video clip captured inside the cafe had already begun to circulate among several group messages and social media feeds. What had started as a simple misunderstanding over a cup of coffee was now a moment that many people had seen with their own eyes. Caldwell stepped outside a few seconds later and looked down the street in the direction Marcus had gone. The federal building was visible in the distance, its glass and steel structure rising above the surrounding offices. For the first time since the encounter began, Caldwell seemed to understand the full weight of the morning. The man he had questioned in front of an entire room of witnesses was not only a federal agent, but a supervisory official responsible for overseeing investigations that sometimes examine the conduct of law enforcement agencies themselves. The realization lingered in his thoughts as he returned slowly to his patrol car parked along the curb. Several days later, the moment inside the cafe had traveled far beyond the city block where it first occurred. The video recorded by one of the customers had been shared thousands of times online, and the quiet tension captured in those few minutes quickly became the subject of conversations across the city. Local news stations replayed the footage repeatedly, analyzing the interaction frame by frame. Commentators spoke about accountability, procedure, and the importance of recognizing authority when it is presented clearly. City officials soon announced that the encounter would be reviewed carefully, not because of a single mistake, but because public trust required transparency whenever situations like this unfolded. Weeks passed, and the review process moved through the necessary steps. Internal reports were compiled, statements were gathered, and legal teams examined every detail of the incident recorded inside the cafe that morning. Eventually, the city reached a decision that would bring the matter to a close. A settlement totaling $5.6 million was approved, acknowledging that the encounter had created consequences that extended beyond a simple misunderstanding. The announcement appeared in headlines across local news outlets and national broadcasts alike. For Marcus Bennett, the moment remained something far simpler than the numbers that later appeared in reports. On a quiet morning several weeks after the settlement was finalized, he returned to the same cafe on Market Street before another meeting downtown. The barista recognized him immediately and placed a fresh cup of coffee on the counter with a polite smile. Marcus thanked her, picked up the cup, and stepped back toward the window. Outside, the city moved exactly as it always had, steady and constant. Marcus took a slow sip of the coffee and looked out at the passing traffic, his expression calm,